Jessica Lane's early life was filled with instability and emotional turmoil. Removed from her biological parents at the age of 14 due to their involvement in large-scale drug trafficking, she entered the foster care system, moving from home to home. By the time she turned 18, Jessica had become embittered and angry, longing for independence but lacking any resources to achieve it. Her final foster placement was with Cynthia Lane, a compassionate but strict woman who had dedicated her life to helping troubled youth. Jessica resented Cynthia's authority and saw her not as a protector, but as an obstacle to her freedom. Over time, this resentment grew into a dangerous obsession. She convinced herself that Cynthia was the only thing standing between her and the life she wanted. Jessica met 21-year-old Tyler West, a drifter with a criminal background, and quickly fell under his influence. The two became inseparable, and together they began plotting Cynthia's murder. They believed that if Cynthia was out of the picture, they could steal her savings, take her car, and start fresh somewhere else. On the night of April 14, 1998, they put their plan into motion. While Cynthia slept, Jessica and Tyler crept into her bedroom. Tyler held her down while Jessica, shaking but determined, plunged a kitchen knife into her chest. She stabbed Cynthia 12 times before she and Tyler fled the scene, stealing her valuables and car. Their escape was short-lived. Just 48 hours later, they were arrested at a roadside motel in Tennessee after using Cynthia's credit cards. Jessica showed no remorse during her trial, coldly stating that Cynthia had been too controlling. The jury, disturbed by her lack of emotion, took just a few hours to sentence her to death in 2000. Last words: "I wanted a new life, but not like this." Last meal: macaroni and cheese, garlic bread, and chocolate pudding. Amber Wilson had always been drawn to trouble. By 16, she had already been arrested multiple times for theft, fraud, and drug possession. She drifted from place to place, staying in homeless shelters and cheap motels, using manipulation and crime to survive. Eventually, she became involved with a group of older criminals who specialized in home invasions and robbery. In April 2005, Amber and two male accomplices set their sights on 74-year-old Henry Lowell, a retired school teacher who lived alone. Amber's role was simple: lure him into a false sense of security. Posing as a stranded driver, she approached him in a grocery store parking lot, pretending to need help with a flat tire. Henry, a kind-hearted man, agreed to assist her. Once Henry was inside Amber's apartment, her accomplices ambushed him. They demanded cash, but when Henry refused, they beat him severely, fracturing his ribs and leaving him barely conscious. Afraid that he might survive and identify them, Amber made the decision to end his life. She grabbed a plastic bag and suffocated him as he struggled weakly beneath her hands. Amber's downfall came when one of her accomplices attempted to pawn Henry's wedding ring. Surveillance footage coupled with phone records placing her at the scene sealed her fate. She was arrested a week later. Though she insisted she had never meant to kill him, the evidence against her was overwhelming. The jury sentenced her to death in 2007. Last words: "I just wanted out of this life." Last meal: fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and peach cobbler. Natalie Brooks had always wanted a better life, but instead of hard work, she sought shortcuts. Growing up in a poor Georgia neighborhood, she turned to crime early, starting with shoplifting and eventually escalating to drug dealing. By 19, she was involved in a string of robberies with her boyfriend, Jason Cole. On October 22, 1994, they targeted a small gas station for what they believed would be a quick and easy robbery. Wearing ski masks and carrying a stolen handgun, they burst into the store, demanding cash from the register. The clerk, 32-year-old Danielle Reyes, hesitated slightly, trying to reach for the silent alarm. Panic took over. Natalie, her hands shaking, pulled the trigger, shooting Danielle in the chest. He collapsed behind the counter, dead before he hit the floor. Jason grabbed the cash register drawer and they fled. However, their escape didn't last long. Surveillance cameras had captured the entire incident. Natalie was arrested at a bus station 48 hours later, still carrying the murder weapon in her bag. During her trial, she insisted that she hadn't meant to fire the gun, claiming it had gone off accidentally. Forensic analysis, however, revealed that she had deliberately pulled the trigger. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before sentencing her to death in 1996. Last words: "I was young and stupid, I deserve this." Last meal: spaghetti with marinara sauce, garlic bread, and apple pie. Samantha Ortiz's crime was one of the most heartbreaking and controversial in recent history. A quiet, withdrawn teenager from a strict Catholic family, Samantha had been raised with strong moral expectations. However, when she found herself pregnant at 19, she was overwhelmed with fear. Terrified of disappointing her family, Samantha hid her pregnancy for the full 9 months. She wore oversized clothing, avoided medical care, and kept her growing belly a secret from everyone around her. On the night of April 23, 2012, Samantha went into labor alone in her bathroom. She endured hours of pain without medical assistance, finally delivering a baby boy. Overcome with exhaustion, fear, and panic, she made a decision that would change her life forever. As the newborn gasped for air, Samantha pressed a towel over his face, silencing his cries. She later placed his tiny body in a plastic bag and hid it in her closet, intending to dispose of it the next day. However, her mother discovered the remains first, leading to a police investigation. At first, Samantha claimed the baby had been stillborn. However, an autopsy proved otherwise. Forensic analysis showed clear signs of suffocation, and her internet search history included topics related to hidden pregnancies and disposing of newborns. Her trial became a media spectacle. Some saw her as a frightened, desperate girl, while others viewed her as a cold-blooded murderer. The jury ultimately ruled that her actions were premeditated, sentencing her to death in 2014. Last words: I was scared. I didn't know what else to do. Last meal: pancakes with maple syrup and orange juice. Tiffany Caldwell's descent into crime was as rapid as it was tragic. Raised in a deeply religious household in Austin, Texas, her teenage years were marked by rebellion. She gravitated toward dangerous individuals, particularly older men who introduced her to a world of crime. By the time she was 18, she had dropped out of high school and moved in with Robert Gaines, a 32-year-old career criminal. Gaines was a master manipulator, filling Tiffany's head with the idea that they were destined for something greater, that the world had wronged them, and that they deserved to take whatever they wanted. His influence over her was undeniable, and when he proposed the idea of kidnapping someone for ransom, she didn't hesitate to go along with it. Their target was Mark Ellis, a 21-year-old college student from a wealthy family. Caldwell played her part perfectly. She staged a breakdown on the side of a remote road, flagging down Mark for help. Once he got out of his car, Gaines emerged with a gun, forcing Mark into a van. For 2 days, they held him captive in an abandoned house, calling his parents with ransom demands. But when negotiations broke down, Gaines made the brutal decision to strangle Mark, and Tiffany did nothing to stop him. The duo attempted to dispose of the body in an old barn, but investigators quickly linked them to the crime. A paper trail of ransom calls, security footage of Tiffany withdrawing money from ATMs, and text messages implicating her in the planning stage led to her arrest. She insisted that she was manipulated, but the evidence was overwhelming. In 1988, she was sentenced to death for her role in the murder. Last words: I let him control me, and now I'm paying the price. Last meal: cheeseburger with extra pickles and a root beer float. Michelle Reyes was an intelligent, ambitious young woman with a promising future, but her overwhelming greed led her down a dark path. Raised in an upper-middle-class household, she had every advantage: good schools, a stable home, and financial security. However, she also had a secret addiction to gambling, and by the time she was 20, she was drowning in debt. Her stepfather, Robert Mason, had been her financial safety net for years, but when he refused to bail her out once again, Michelle saw only one solution: kill him and collect his life insurance payout. She spent weeks researching undetectable poisons, settling on aconitine, a highly lethal toxin. On the night of the murder, Michelle invited Mason over for a bonding dinner, preparing his favorite steak and lacing his wine with the poison. Within an hour, he began experiencing paralysis and cardiac arrest. She called 911, feigning panic, but toxicology reports raised red flags. Investigators quickly uncovered her internet search history, including queries about painless ways to kill and how to disguise poisoning as a heart attack. Michelle remained arrogant throughout her trial, convinced she could manipulate the jury. However, the overwhelming forensic evidence led to a swift conviction. In 2010, she was sentenced to death, with the prosecution calling her a textbook example of premeditated murder. Last words: I thought I was smarter than everyone. Last meal: lobster tail, garlic butter, and a glass of white wine. Cassandra Lee's case remains one of the most controversial on record, blurring the line between self-defense and premeditated murder. At 20, she was convicted of setting fire to her home, killing her abusive husband, Gregory Lee. Cassandra had married Gregory at 18, believing he was her escape from a difficult home life. Instead, she found herself trapped in an increasingly violent relationship. Isolated from friends and family, she suffered in silence as Gregory's abuse escalated. Police were called to their home multiple times, but Cassandra never pressed charges, fearing his wrath. Her breaking point came after Gregory publicly assaulted her, leaving her with a broken jaw and fractured ribs. The very next day, Cassandra emptied their joint bank account, purchased gasoline, and returned home with one goal: freedom. As Gregory lay passed out from a night of drinking, she doused the bedroom in gasoline and lit a match. She watched the flames consume the house before turning herself in at the police station, confessing immediately. Her defense team argued that she had suffered years of abuse and saw no other way out. Domestic violence advocacy groups rallied behind her, but the prosecution framed her as a cold-blooded murderer, pointing out that she had planned every detail. Despite the public outcry, the jury convicted her of first-degree murder, sentencing her to death in 2001. Last words: "I just wanted to be free." Last meal: fried shrimp, coleslaw, and vanilla ice cream. Rachel Monroe's story is a terrifying example of obsession turned deadly. A talented IT specialist in Denver, Rachel was known as quiet and introverted. However, beneath her reserved exterior, she was harboring an unhealthy fixation on her coworker, 24-year-old Kyle Dawson. Rachel's infatuation with Kyle started harmlessly enough. She followed him on social media, found excuses to talk to him at work, and memorized details about his life. But when Kyle made it clear that he wasn't interested in her romantically, Rachel became unhinged. She hacked into his email, created fake profiles to harass women he dated, and even left threatening notes on his car. Coworkers noticed her erratic behavior, but no one intervened until it was too late. One evening, after seeing Kyle on a date with another woman, Rachel reached her breaking point. She waited for him in the parking garage of his apartment, hiding in the shadows with a knife. When he arrived, she ambushed him, stabbing him over 30 times in a frenzied attack. Kyle's body was found hours later, and investigators quickly linked Rachel to the crime. A search of her home uncovered disturbing journals detailing her obsession and plans to punish Kyle for rejecting her. Despite attempts by her defense to claim insanity, the jury saw the act as premeditated murder. She was sentenced to death in 2013. Last words: "I never meant for this to happen." Last meal: bacon-wrapped filet mignon with baked potato. Vanessa Parker and her best friend, Michelle Lowe, carried out a gruesome double homicide that prosecutors described as a thrill kill. From a young age, Parker had shown an unhealthy fascination with crime and violence. She and Lowe, inseparable since high school, had always been drawn to the darker side of life, often discussing famous serial killers and fantasizing about committing the perfect crime. By the time they turned 21, Parker and Lowe were living together with two other young women, Emily Carter and Brooke Jennings, in a small apartment in Portland, Oregon. Over time, Parker and Lowe began resenting their roommates, viewing them as weak and sheltered. They wanted to prove their superiority by taking lives, just to see what it felt like. On the night of April 17, 2003, Parker and Lowe put their twisted plan into action. They waited until Carter and Jennings were asleep before attacking. Parker stabbed Emily Carter 23 times with a kitchen knife, while Lowe smothered Brooke Jennings with a pillow. After ensuring both were dead, they meticulously cleaned the apartment, removing all traces of their involvement. However, their alibi quickly fell apart when inconsistencies emerged in their statements to police. Forensic evidence contradicted their version of events, and a journal recovered from Parker's room detailed their step-by-step plan to kill. During her trial, Parker showed little remorse, at one point even describing the experience as exhilarating. The jury sentenced her to death with no hesitation. Last words: "I hope they forgive me." Last meal: pepperoni pizza and chocolate cake. Laura Simmons was convicted of one of the most tragic crimes imaginable: the murder of her own 2-year-old daughter, Lily Simmons. Raised in a broken home, Laura had struggled with depression and anxiety from a young age. By the time she turned 21, she was a single mother, overwhelmed and emotionally disconnected from her child. On the evening of August 3, 1991, Laura reached her breaking point. Frustrated, exhausted, and feeling trapped, she made the horrifying decision to end her daughter's life. She ran a warm bath, placed Lily inside, and held her under the water until she stopped moving. Afterwards, she sat on the bathroom floor for nearly an hour, staring at the lifeless body of her daughter, before calling 911 to report an accidental drowning. Initially, investigators believed her story, but an autopsy revealed bruising around Lily's arms and neck, indicating she had struggled. When confronted with the evidence, Laura finally admitted the truth. She claimed she hadn't wanted her daughter to suffer through life the way she had. Despite the defense arguing that Laura suffered from severe mental illness, the jury found her actions intentional and cruel. She was sentenced to death in 1993. Last words: "I loved her, but I was broken." Last meal: pancakes with strawberries and whipped cream. Kayla Foster had always appeared to be a hardworking and responsible young woman. She was employed as an administrative assistant at Monroe accounting firm, where her boss, 55-year-old David Monroe, had taken her under his wing. However, what no one knew was that Kayla had been secretly embezzling money from the company for months. When Monroe discovered inconsistencies in the financial records and confronted her, Kayla realized that her carefully constructed lies were about to unravel. Instead of accepting responsibility, she chose to eliminate the only person who could expose her. On August 14, 2015, after everyone else had left the office, she lured Monroe into his office under the pretense of discussing the missing funds. Once inside, she struck him in the head with a heavy metal paperweight. As he tried to regain his balance, she grabbed a pair of scissors from his desk and stabbed him 12 times. Foster then staged the scene to look like a robbery gone wrong, but investigators quickly uncovered flaws in her story. Surveillance footage from a nearby building showed her entering the office alone and leaving in a hurry. A search of her apartment led police to Monroe's blood-stained clothes, which she had failed to dispose of properly. At her trial, Foster expressed regret but claimed she had panicked. The jury was unmoved by her plea, convicting her of first-degree murder and sentencing her to death in 2017. Last words: "I should have walked away." Last meal: Southern fried chicken, mac and cheese, and cornbread. Olivia Sanchez was deeply in love with her longtime boyfriend, Marco Rivera, but their relationship had become strained. Marco, tired of Olivia's possessiveness and jealousy, had repeatedly told her he wanted to end things. Unwilling to accept rejection, Olivia made a deadly decision. On June 3, 2002, she invited Marco over for dinner, pretending she wanted to talk things through peacefully. However, hidden under the dining table was a loaded handgun. As they ate, Marco once again insisted that their relationship was over. In a fit of rage, Olivia pulled out the gun and shot him twice in the chest at point-blank range. Instead of fleeing, Olivia calmly called 911 and claimed that Marco had attacked her. However, neighbors told a different story. They had heard only Olivia yelling before the gunshots. Forensic evidence also contradicted her claims. Marco had been sitting when he was shot, with no signs of struggle. At her trial, Olivia broke down in tears, claiming she had acted out of blind desperation. However, prosecutors argued that the crime was premeditated, pointing out that she had purchased the gun weeks before the murder. The jury agreed, sentencing her to death in 2004. Last words: "I couldn't let him leave me." Last meal: taco platter with rice and beans. Kelsey Novak had no history of violent crime. She was a struggling college dropout working as a bartender in Las Vegas when she got entangled in a high-stakes kidnapping for ransom plot. Desperate for money and easily manipulated, she agreed to help her then-boyfriend Derek Mason abduct Charles Grant, a wealthy businessman. The plan was simple: lure Grant to a hotel under the pretense of a business deal, drug him, and hold him hostage until his family paid a $500,000 ransom. Novak played a crucial role, using her charm to gain Grant's trust and ensuring he was alone at the time of the abduction. However, things went horribly wrong when Grant fought back in the van. In a panic, Mason strangled him, killing him instantly. Now faced with a body instead of a hostage, Novak and Mason attempted to cover their tracks. They wrapped Grant in a tarp and dumped him in a desert ravine, hoping nature would erase the evidence. However, their plan quickly unraveled. Surveillance footage showed Novak meeting Grant at the hotel, and forensic analysis found her DNA under his fingernails, suggesting a struggle. During her trial, Novak insisted she had never intended for Grant to die, painting herself as an unwilling participant. However, the jury found her complicit in the crime, especially given the premeditated nature of the kidnapping. She was sentenced to death in 2017. Last words: this wasn't supposed to happen. Last meal: clam chowder, bread rolls, and iced tea. Madison Clark had been raised by her grandmother, Evelyn Clark, after her parents died in a car accident. Despite Evelyn's devotion, Madison harbored resentment, believing she was owed a better life. When she learned that Evelyn had a sizable inheritance set aside, she began plotting ways to get her hands on the money faster. In late 1996, Madison started researching poisons, specifically ones that could mimic natural causes of death. She settled on digitalis, a deadly plant-based toxin that affects the heart. She began slipping small amounts into her grandmother's tea over several weeks, causing gradual health deterioration. When Evelyn suffered what appeared to be a fatal cardiac arrest, Madison immediately called 911, playing the role of a grieving granddaughter. Her plan initially seemed foolproof, but toxicology reports flagged abnormal levels of digitalis in Evelyn's system. Investigators also discovered suspicious search histories on Madison's computer related to poisoning methods. Even more damning, they found draft versions of Evelyn's will, showing Madison's attempt to forge signatures to ensure she inherited everything. When confronted, Madison confessed, stating she had acted out of desperation. Despite her defense team arguing for diminished mental capacity, the jury was unconvinced. She was sentenced to death in 1996. Last words: I regret everything. Last meal: chocolate chip pancakes with syrup. Erin Powell grew up in a rough neighborhood and fell into a criminal lifestyle early, dropping out of school and associating with known felons. By the time she was 23, she had become involved with a group of home invaders who targeted wealthy homes. The plan was always to get in and out undetected, until one robbery turned deadly. On the night of October 19, 1988, Powell and 3 accomplices broke into the Caldwell family home, assuming it was empty. However, Paul and Sharon Caldwell and their teenage son Matthew were inside. The intruders panicked, and the situation quickly escalated into a massacre. One of Powell's accomplices shot Paul in the chest. Sharon and Matthew were restrained, then executed to eliminate witnesses. The group fled, believing they had left no trail, but a careless mistake led to their downfall. Powell had taken a piece of jewelry from the scene, a unique family heirloom that was later found in her possession. This, along with other forensic evidence, quickly tied her to the crime. Though Powell hadn't pulled the trigger, prosecutors argued that her involvement in planning and carrying out the crime made her equally responsible. The jury agreed, sentencing her to death in 1989. Last words: tell my mom I'm sorry. Last meal: ribeye steak, garlic mashed potatoes, and red wine. Danielle Hart and her fiancé, Mark Jensen, had been together for 3 years and were just days away from their wedding when tragedy struck. Friends described them as the perfect couple, deeply in love, but behind closed doors, their relationship had become toxic. Mark had begun having second thoughts about marriage, and when he told Danielle that he wanted to postpone the wedding, she snapped. On the evening of May 10, 2014, Hart invited Mark over for dinner, pretending she wanted to discuss things calmly. She cooked his favorite meal, poured him a glass of wine, and engaged in what seemed like a heartfelt conversation. Then, in an act of cold-blooded execution, she retrieved a handgun from her purse and shot him twice in the chest. Afterwards, she calmly called 911, claiming an intruder had broken in and killed Mark. However, investigators quickly found inconsistencies in her story. There were no signs of forced entry, and forensic evidence showed that Mark had been seated and completely off guard when he was shot. A search of Hart's internet history revealed disturbing searches such as how to get away with murder and fastest way to kill someone without pain. At her trial, Hart tried to portray herself as an emotionally distressed woman who had acted in a moment of passion. However, the overwhelming evidence of premeditation led to a swift conviction. She was sentenced to death in 2016. Last words: I loved him, but I couldn't let him go. Last meal: sushi platter with miso soup. Lillian Morris was raised in a deeply religious household in rural Kentucky where discussions of sex and pregnancy were considered shameful. Growing up, she was taught strict moral values and feared disappointing her family. At 22, she found herself in a secret relationship with a married man, which led to an unplanned pregnancy. Terrified of the consequences, she hid the pregnancy from everyone, avoiding medical care and making sure no one would suspect her condition. On March 4, 1993, Morris went into labor alone in the bathroom of her small apartment. In excruciating pain, she delivered the baby in her bathtub. When she heard the newborn's cries, panic set in. Fearing discovery, she pressed her hand over the baby's mouth and nose, suffocating the infant. After the horrific act, she wrapped the body in a towel, placed it in a shoebox, and buried it in a wooded area behind her building. For years, the crime remained undiscovered. Morris carried on with her life as though nothing had happened. But in 1999, a heavy rainstorm caused the ground to shift, unearthing the remains. A passerby found the box and alerted authorities. DNA testing linked the infant to Morris. Under intense interrogation, she eventually confessed. Her trial sparked nationwide debate. Some argued that she was a victim of societal pressure, while others believed she had committed an unforgivable act. The jury sided with the prosecution, citing the deliberate and calculated nature of her actions. She was sentenced to death in 1993. Last words: I don't deserve forgiveness. Last meal: biscuits and gravy with scrambled eggs. Haley Benson seemed to have the perfect life, a beautiful home, a successful husband, and a reputation for being the ideal wife. However, behind the scenes, her marriage to David Benson was deteriorating. Rumors of his infidelity, combined with their growing financial problems, drove her to the brink of madness. Rather than confront him or seek a divorce, she decided that the only way out was murder. Benson reached out to an ex-boyfriend, Brandon Miles, who had a history of violent crimes. She offered him $20,000 to kill her husband, providing him with detailed instructions on where and when to strike. On the night of November 7, 2010, David was shot execution-style in his car outside his gym. Surveillance footage showed a masked figure approaching the vehicle, but authorities quickly linked the crime to Benson after discovering suspicious bank withdrawals and incriminating text messages between her and Miles. Despite trying to frame the murder as a robbery gone wrong, Benson was arrested within days. At trial, she claimed she had been emotionally manipulated into orchestrating the crime, but the jury rejected her defense. The prosecution painted her as a cold, calculating woman who had prioritized money over human life. She was sentenced to death in 2012. Last words: I lost control. Last meal: barbecue ribs, cornbread, and sweet tea. Paige Warner was an aspiring model living in Miami, known for her beauty and charm, but behind the glamorous facade, she had a dark history of manipulation and greed. Warner had a pattern of dating wealthy men and persuading them to spend lavishly on her before abandoning them. However, in 2006, she took things to a deadly level when she targeted Tyler Grant, a successful businessman who had recently inherited a fortune. She befriended Grant at a high-end nightclub, quickly gaining his trust. Over the course of a few weeks, she convinced him to take her on an exclusive getaway to a secluded cabin in the woods. Grant had no idea that Warner was plotting to kill him for his money. On the second night of their trip, Warner lured Grant outside under the pretense of stargazing. When he turned his back, she pulled out a handgun and shot him execution-style in the back of the head. She then dragged his body into a shallow grave she had prepared earlier and stole his car, wallet, and valuables. Thinking she had committed the perfect crime, Warner used Grant's credit card the next day to book a luxury hotel. Investigators tracked the transaction and found her within 48 hours. During the trial, she showed no remorse, insisting that she deserved a better life. The jury convicted her of first-degree murder, sentencing her to death in 2008. Last words: I deserve this. Last meal: fried catfish with tartar sauce. Emily Shaw was once a trusted daycare worker who was adored by the children she cared for. However, over time, she grew to resent the families she worked for, believing that they were privileged and ungrateful for what they had. She saw herself as overworked and underpaid, blaming the wealthy parents for her struggles. This deep-seated resentment turned into something sinister. On the night of December 14, 1985, Shaw set fire to an apartment complex that housed several of the families she worked for. She knew that most of the children would be asleep and unable to escape. The fire spread rapidly, trapping the residents inside. 5 children, all under the age of 10, perished in the flames, along with 1 adult. The tragedy shook the entire community, and investigators worked tirelessly to determine the cause of the fire. Surveillance footage from a nearby building showed Shaw near the scene just moments before the blaze erupted. When questioned, she initially claimed she had been out for a walk, but her inconsistencies quickly raised suspicions. Eventually, forensic analysis confirmed that the fire had been deliberately set, leading to Shaw's arrest. Her trial was one of the most emotional in recent history, with grieving families demanding justice. Shaw remained emotionless throughout the proceedings, only speaking during her sentencing to say she was ready for her fate. She was sentenced to death in 1987. Last words, "I am ready." Last meal, strawberry shortcake with whipped cream. These cases are haunting reminders of how quickly life can spiral into tragedy. While debates on capital punishment continue, these young women serve as examples of how crime, desperation, and poor choices can lead to the ultimate punishment.